everyone, welcome to another episode of Voices That Matter with Enlinature. I'm your host Sadah Khan, and today our theme for discussion is climate communication, sustainability, and meaningful actions. And for that, we are joined by Rachel Sparkles, a sustainability and communication professional with over decades of experience working across government, media, and climate focused sectors. So, my first question is sustainable development often requires a balancing environmental protection with economic and social priorities. From your experience, how can climate communication effectively influence this balance without oversimplifying the trades off?
You, Sadah. It's really nice to meet you, and it's great to be here. So thank you for having me on. And thank you for your question. It's really quite an interesting one because when we think about sustainable development, sustainable development itself really sits at the intersection of environmental protection, economic stability, and social well-being. And climate communication is the bridge that connects that scientific understanding and policy decisions to public awareness and community response. And quite often we see that climate policy involves balancing the trade-offs that you mentioned between the long-term environmental benefits of emissions reductions against short-term economic costs, such as higher energy prices, potential job losses in the fossil fuel sectors, reduced GDP growth. And I think the biggest mistake that climate communication makes is pretending that there are no trade-offs and oversimplifying. People tend to not trust that. And I actually think we've done a bit of a disservice in climate communication by pretending that there aren't trade-offs. People generally know that there's tensions between costs, jobs, and environmental protection. So the role of communication, or climate communication specifically, is to make those trade-offs visible and understandable rather than pretending that they don't exist or oversimplifying them. So the goal is ultimately to help people understand why certain decisions need to be made and why the trade-offs need to happen. So this is particularly important in the context of the current global economic situation where more people are struggling to get by, climate skepticism and political dissatisfaction are on the rise. And I think an example of this is that we saw quite clearly is in the backlash to the EU's Green Deal. So there was, across several European countries, farmers protested environmental regulations that they felt threatened their livelihoods. So they had, tractors blocking city centres and like a really strong public resistance, particularly around, the land use rules and fertiliser restrictions that the Green Deal was proposing. And this was sort of revealing an opposition to climate policy, yes, but also a communications failure. So, many of the farmers felt that the policies had been designed and announced without sufficient engagement and without acknowledging the impact on them. So, the benefits of the environmental protection were framed at a societal level, while the costs were experienced very personally and immediately by the farmers. So those protests ultimately forced policymakers to communicate more clearly about how climate and environmental goals intersect with things like food security and rural livelihoods. So it's not just what climate communication says, but when it says it and with whom and how early it happens. So effective climate communication really needs to involve affected groups earlier in the policy process and openly discuss what will be done to manage those trade-offs rather than treating them as an afterthought. But the most effective communication actually connects to people's lived experience in the moment. So a current example of this is the move to the electrification of vehicles, which has historically been framed as an environmental or lifestyle choice, mainly for people who really cared about the environment or wanted to have a really high-tech car. But now with the rising cost of fuel due to global conflicts, it's increasingly communicated as an economic decision because it's lower lower running costs and fuel savings. So this sort of shift in the narrative is what moves climate action from niche environmentalism to mainstream. So I would say sustainable development thrives when climate messaging. Climate messages are framed around tangible co-benefits, like better transport or stronger local economies, rather than focusing only on the threats.
Okay, so transition to question two. That idea of balancing competing priorities naturally leads to the question of who actually carries responsibility for making those choices. In the context of sustainable development, how do you see the role of governments, corporations, and grassroots activists involving in driving meaningful climate actions, particularly in vulnerable regions?
Absolutely. So I think we're moving away from this idea that there's one hero actor in climate action. Historically, responsibility sat primarily with governments, but we're moving to a much more distributed system of influence, especially in vulnerable regions, such as low-income countries or countries that are exposed to climate impacts. We really require a coordinated action from governments, corporations, and grassroots activists. So governments still set the direction through policy, regulation, and investment, which is critical, but they play more of a coordinator role these days because they're not acting in isolation anymore. Corporations, on the other hand, are playing a much bigger role than they used to because they are emitters themselves, but they are also major innovators, and they increasingly are acting as political actors, influencing the pace of transition, partly because they have to. They're exposed to climate risks, supply chain disruption, changing consumer expectations. And in some cases, they're actually moving faster than policy implemented by government. But grassroots groups have arguably the most underestimated power to ensure accountability from both corporations and governments by creating political pressure and shifting social norms. So in Delhi, in India, the city experiences terrible air quality in winter, roughly 30 times above the recommended safety levels from the WHO, which is, really dangerous for large portions of the population, particularly elderly and children. And it's a really, current problem because it leads to illness and it's really visible and it impacts everyone's daily lives. So grassroots environmental groups in India have been quite vocal in protesting for the right to breathe safely, an issue which hasn't had much traction from governments. But off the back of sustained public pressure, particularly from youth groups, actually, Delhi's real-time air quality index network has expanded significantly over the past few years. So I would say the most effective approaches, as I say, do tend to be collaborative. You'll see governments funding something, setting the rules, and then private sector scaling and implementing it. But communities shape it and ensure accountability. So it's less about who leads and more about whether those three are aligned. And communication is kind of the glue that holds that together.
You have touched there on the larger system that climate shape outcomes, and that raises a question many people struggle with personally. When the scale of the crisis is so clearly structural, people often wonder where their own action fits in or whether they matter at all. So, building on that, from a sustainable development perspective, how much impact do individual choices actually have compared to broader systematic changes in addressing climate and environmental challenges?
Yeah, this one I feel quite strongly about. Individual choices do matter, but not in the way we've traditionally framed it. So individual choices matter mostly because they influence systems, not because they individually reduce emissions on their own. And the issue is we've sometimes overemphasized personal responsibility to the point where people feel either guilty or overwhelmed or they disengage entirely. And this is actually a purposeful tactic used by corporations called the individualization of responsibility, which is a tactic used by corporations to shift the burden of environmental problems onto the consumer instead of addressing the system. So it deflects accountability away from corporations so they don't have to do anything about the problem, and instead individuals end up holding each other to account. That's not taking away from the importance of things like, like of your own individual actions, recycling, using your reusable coffee cup, eating less meat. But I use those examples because the reality of those ones is the scale of those choices doesn't match the problem. And we often hyper focus on actions of individuals that don't move the needle all that much compared to broader systemic changes such as government policy or corporate practices. So, individual behaviors can reduce environmental harm. Eating less meat or shifting to a plant-based diet does lower emissions or land use. Reducing waste, recycling, conserving energy lowers resource demand. And these actions do reduce emissions, but their overall impact is constrained because the bulk of emissions come from fossil fuel producers and other industrial processes, power generation, supply chains beyond individual control. And often the sustainable option is more expensive, and individuals need to go out of their way to make their actions sustainable rather than having systems in place that help the population do this easily on a larger scale. For example, you might have a household that is reducing their emissions by installing solar panels, but if the national grid still relies heavily on coal, then the overall emissions are going to remain high. So when we talk about the impact of individual actions, those actions that shape systems or lead to collective action that shape social norms or influence markets have more of an outsized influence. So I'll use the example of growing consumer demand for ethical fashion. This is a cultural shift that's pushed brands to publish sustainability reports. So this is an example of where sustainable behaviors become common and they shift social expectations. So I mean, overall, it's not to say individual actions are not important, because they absolutely are, and we know that small individual actions collectively add up. But I think the more helpful framing is your individual actions are part of a bigger system, and they matter most when they contribute to collective change. And that tends to land better with people because it's honest, but it still gives them a role.
So for our final question, I would like to bring this back to the human level. For people who care about environmental sustainability but feel overwhelmed by the scale of climate issues, what is the most meaningful place to start?
Yeah, I think a lot of people really care about climate issues. They just feel completely overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. And when that happens, we often default to doing lots of small things or nothing at all, which is a completely understandable place to be. But what I usually say is don't try and do everything. The best starting point is to focus on your sphere of influence and not the entire climate system, which we can't do that alone. So pick one area of your life where you have control and really go deep on it. For example, you might ask, how am I using energy at home? What sort of transport choices am I making? What are my food habits like? How am I spending my money, or where is my money being invested? And sort of pick something that you can actually change that not everybody can change the way they get around transport. Public transport isn't an option for everybody. Putting solar panels on your house isn't an option for everybody. But there might be smaller choices that you can make, and dialing into those and making them consistently, can help build momentum. But if you want high impact individual actions, you're going to need to go for ones that have influence over systemic change, as we just discussed. So that first and foremost is about engaging at the political level and voting for candidates with robust climate policies and goals. As we know, government have the power to shape policy or to force systemic change. So that might look like, that looks like voting and campaigning, but you might also put pressure on corporations by you signing petitions that ask corporations to implement sustainable practices, pay fair wages, or minimize their environmental waste. Another more systemic change you can do is to place pressure on financial systems to move away from fossil fuels by looking at what you're investing in within your personal funds. If you've got a retirement fund or if you've got a personal fund, switching to ethical or low carbon options or moving to an ethical bank entirely. So I think these are really important changes because people need to feel like their actions connect to something bigger. And if it just feels like a drop in the ocean, it's really hard to stay motivated. So it's about starting small, but not staying small, kind of building from personal action into something that has a bit more reach. So that's usually where people start to feel a little bit less overwhelmed and hopefully more empowered.
Okay, so Rach, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Your perspective on climate communication, system change, and meaningful actions offer the powerful way to think about sustainability.